Welcome to the Institute for Global Engagement's Faith and International Affairs conference call series. My name is Dennis Hoover, Vice President for Research and Publications at IGE, and I'll serve as the moderator on today's call. Thank you to everyone on the call. Our topic today is Islamic schools in Nigeria, which are of increasing importance, not only in terms of the achievement of development goals, but also in terms of the growing challenges of religious conflict and socio-political discord. This is complex terrain, and we're fortunate to have as our guide Dr. Helen Boyle. Dr. Boyle is an associate professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at Florida State University. Her research focuses on education in developing country contexts, with a particular emphasis on Islamic educational institutions in North and West Africa and in the Middle East. She is the author of Quranic Schools, Agents of Preservation and published by Routledge, which looks at the cultural and pedagogical aspects of Quranic and Islamic schools across Morocco and Yemen and Nigeria. Her recent research related to Islamic schools includes USAID-funded sector assessment studies in Ghana and Mali. She is also the author of an article in the current issue of IGE's quarterly journal, The Review of Faith and International Affairs, which is focused on faith schools in sub-Saharan Africa. And before we get started, just a few words on today's call format. We'll begin with 15 to 20 minutes of remarks from Dr. Boyle, and then we'll open the floor for your questions. If you'd like to ask Dr. Boyle a question, please press 5* at any point during the call, and you'll be placed in the queue. Finally, please also note that this call is on the record, and an audio recording will be made available on the IGE website. So with that introduction, turn now to our call. Thanks again, Helen, for joining us today to share your expertise on the history and current realities and future prospects of Islamic schools in Nigeria. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for this topic today. I thought I would start by just giving a little bit more background on some of the work I have done in Nigeria, Mali, and Ghana in researching Islamic schools there, because I'm going to draw from some of these studies as I talk. I worked on several USAID-funded projects and sector studies which looked at the Islamic school sector both in Ghana and in Mali, and worked with Islamic schools in Nigeria as part of a project to improve English language literacy in Nigeria. We worked in 3 states there. So through these experiences, I've both had the opportunity to collect data on these schools, to sit in classes, to interview teachers and talk to students, and participate in focus groups with families, and also to talk to some of the policymakers and ulama, or intellectuals in all of these countries on their views of this sort of emerging sector of what I would call integrated Islamic schools. And those are going to be the main focus of what I talk about today. And let me explain what I mean by that. In West Africa, there seems to, and in other places I should add, there seems to be a movement afoot whereby traditionally Islamic schools are adopting secular curricula into their overall program of studies. And they are offering to parents and communities an alternative choice to public schools. They are offering, for example, some schools that include, say, foreign language and math, some that will include a full government curriculum in addition to religious studies. And this is a significant development in the region in light of some of the constraints to the provision of education to all children in the region. By that I believe that some of the government agencies are not able to provide access to schooling to all kids who need them, particularly in Nigeria, where there are estimates of at least 10.5 million children out of school, and that is about 17% of the out-of-school population of children in the world. So the idea of another venue or another set of schools that can provide education to children, whether Islamic or Christian or whatever, is a very interesting development and a very perhaps necessary avenue to pursue in the endeavor to reach the Millennium Development Goals and universal primary education. So in terms of why look at Islamic schools in West Africa, and particularly in Nigeria, Islamic schools are already in existence. They're financed and they're set up with buildings and teachers and students, particularly in the north of Nigeria, but in other areas of the country as well. They offer convenience, community connections, and basically proximity. They're usually very local. They're in communities. They're near communities or villages, and they're organized and run with some community involvement. There's a growing consciousness among Muslim parents in the north of Nigeria from studies that I have done that their children need to learn English and need some secular subjects if they're going to participate more meaningfully in political and economic life. And parents see Islamic schools as an avenue where they can have it all. They can have a religiously based education, and they can also help their children access some of the subjects and skills and topics that might lead to future employment. States in northern Nigeria have also noted this phenomenon, knowing that they are not in a position to build thousands and thousands of new schools at this point. They're looking at schools that exist, and these religious schools that exist, with a little assistance, could perhaps increase their enrollment numbers such that states will be, providing access to education for all children, which they can't do through the existence of public schools alone. Okay. Now, other reasons to look at these schools is there are many negative stereotypes in circulation, along with a lot of inaccurate information about what the schools do and whether they're brainwashing children or creating terrorists or things like that. So I think that there's also a need to look at these schools and what they're really doing to provide some good information about what's happening as opposed to feeding some of these stereotypes. And in addition, there are donor agencies that are looking at these schools, again, in terms of will they accept aid, will they let us train teachers, could we provide books and services to help further their mission to provide a kind of well-rounded education to all children. So those are some of the reasons to look at these schools, in addition to just what seem to be some growing numbers in places like Mali, for example. In the last study I did, that Islamic school sector, the madrasa sector, was growing by about 15% a year. So that was pretty impressive growth, and it certainly outpaced the growth of just public schools. Now, to understand these Islamic schools, it's important to look at what the ethos was traditionally for education in Islam and for setting up an Islamic school, because it's somewhat different than contemporary ideas of why we send our kids to school in, say, Western countries or even, in public schools in West Africa. So knowledge in Islam. Okay? And the underlying philosophy of Islamic education is that knowledge comes from the development of the whole person, the physical, the intellectual, moral, and spiritual dimensions of the person. Therefore, education, which is the quest for knowledge, for Muslims must include religious study. Right? Spiritual knowledge is as important as scientific empirical knowledge, and indeed it complements it. And one prevailing thought is that by learning about the world and coming to know the world around you, you come to know God even more. Now, that all sounds very good. I want you to picture for a minute, let's say a triangle, and then picture next to it an upside-down triangle, one that's balancing on its apex. And I use this image to talk about some of the different assumptions in, quote, Western education and Islamic education. If you think of that pyramid that's standing on its apex, right? In Islam, in order to develop that whole person, you start with the most important thing, which would be, in this case, the Quran, right? The Word of God revealed to mankind. So children generally start with the Quran. That's what's taught in Quranic schools, and it's considered one of the first things children should learn. And they tend to memorize it. And once they memorize it, then they move on to looking at it, analyzing it, understanding, offshoots, fiqh, for example, which is jurisprudence, Arabic grammar, interpretation, and other things like that. But the idea is that children start with something very specific, sort of the apex of that triangle, that upside-down triangle. And then as they move through their education, the base of what they study broadens so that by the time they have become, say, a scholar or something, they're looking at a whole range of topics, okay? But they started with something very specific, which is the Quran. If you think of Western education and think of a kindergarten in, I don't know, the U.S. or France or something like that, we tend to be the triangle that's sitting on its broad base, right? We start with a lot of different subjects. Children look at, music and art and math and science and social studies and language arts and, gym and things like that. And then as they go up through their education, if they go all the way up to become a scholar or something, they're specializing in some, very obscure, let's say, or very specific topic, right? So just the paradigm of education, if you think of it in this visual idea of two triangles, one on its base, one on its apex, it's a very different way to approach education. And I do think that understanding that some of the assumptions in Islamic education are different is very important in then looking at some of the schools that exist in, say, northern Nigeria and thinking about how to approach them, how to look at the extension of their mission. And it's something I think that the proprietors and headmasters of these schools and the ulama in that country are doing as well. So just to sort of close this loop. So Islamic schools in Nigeria and other countries, Mali and Ghana, right, came with traders and caravans from the Arab world, focused on Quranic memorization, had as their goal the sort of refinement of the person, manners, morals, perfections of the soul, knowledge of God and God's creation. Children tended to work according to their ability. It was not a test-driven environment. People weren't really tested. They simply mastered material and moved on to the next thing. Learning was very relational. It was almost as if the kids learned in groups and they had a sort of master-apprentice relationship with the teacher. And the schools prepared them for afterlife. Now, if you look at public education in Nigeria or other places, generally it is connected to economic advancement goals and national development goals, less spiritual development and all that kind of stuff. It's really aimed at giving people skills to find employment. Not that it necessarily does that all that well, but that ostensibly is where it is heading. There's a lot of focus on the formation of the citizen, and the school environment is fairly competitive, right? There are grades and specific points where you can pass or fail out. There's competition sometimes for places at higher levels, and at least on paper, there's more focus on some of the skill development as opposed to the kind of personal development. Okay. So those are some of the key differences, right, between Islamic schools and some of the public schools that exist. In terms of just numbers, how widespread are Islamic schools? In many West African countries, you'll find a Quranic school at very least in almost every village or town with a Muslim population, and children will study at least some of the Quran, either after school, during the summer, or whatever, even if they go to public school. Numbers, including in the most recent review of Faith and International Affairs, suggest that in some cases the scope of private schools in West Africa or in other countries in Africa is growing. I certainly found that in Mali when I did my research there. For example, in Mali in 2009, there were over 1,000 registered madrasas, registered with the government, and they served almost 250,000 pupils. Okay. In Nigeria, for example, some research in 2010, not conducted by me, but cite the World Development Report, suggests that 8 out of 10 out-of-school children were attending a religious school. Right? So that's if there are 10.5 million children out of school in Nigeria, that's a lot of children who are going to a religious school, which says that that's a pretty impressive presence. That said, this current issue of the religious review of faith and international affairs does suggest that religious schooling is not as ubiquitous as has been reported, that half of all children are not attending religious schools, across the African continent, more like maybe 15% or whatever, but that's still a substantial number. Some recent research in Nigeria also suggests that the government overcounts the number of schools religious schools that actually offer secular subjects, and that religious authorities tend to undercount the number of religious schools that actually offer secular subjects. So in some ways numbers are unclear, but I think it's fair to say that there's a substantial presence, especially in Nigeria and in other countries of West Africa, of Islamic schools that are endeavoring to stretch into the role of education providers across the board and not just in the religious sphere. In Nigeria, this is done religious schools registering with the government. The government has over the past 20 years, developed a process whereby schools can kind of register and qualify to become education providers in a larger sense. This is also found in Ghana and in Mali as well. All of these governments have set up, whether at the state level or the federal level, some kind of a Islamic school unit or something that will oversee some of the regulation of these schools. From discussions with both religious leaders and government policymakers in Nigeria and other places, there are pros and cons to this arrangement, but registration with the government for the religious schools implies some accountability and some official oversight, which is generally looked on favorably. The schools are still private, though, and most authority still rests with the headmaster or the proprietor, so there's often a bit of confusion as to who's really setting the rules here. Interestingly enough, the religious schools that I had talked to and looked at in 2004, 2006, and beyond that, all seem very open to training opportunities and assistance, provided it doesn't compromise the religious mission of the school. And in fact, most of the schools seemed quite willing to add to their curriculum. They looked on it as a form of growth. The school proprietors seemed quite entrepreneurial in sensing that there was a market niche here that they could fill. And you saw this quite a bit in northern Nigeria. Another aspect of the sort of registration and government oversight in terms of talking to communities is that they feel they have more say in religious schools than in the public schools. And this is probably because these religious schools charge some fees and they're essentially private, although they're registered with the government. And this gives parents and communities a greater voice in these schools. The government will also sometimes pay secular subject teachers, for example, English teachers in Nigeria or French teachers in Mali, because the schools don't have that capacity, right now on the ground, so that they will get teachers from the public sector who will come and teach some of those subjects in their schools. And that's a big boost for these schools. They may also get books and some supplies from the government. And often the transition between, say, a religious primary school and a government junior secondary school is eased for children once a school is registered with the government. So there are a lot of policy implications then to religious schools registering with the government. In Nigeria, these schools that are registered refer to themselves as Islamia schools. In Mali, they call themselves madrasas, et cetera, et cetera. In Ghana, they're makaranta. But this registration process is kind of how these schools go from being solely religious education providers to providing a more well-rounded curriculum. Usually for registration, they have to accept that they will offer the bulk of the government curriculum. Now, in terms of how they're doing with this, in school visits and collecting data from classroom observations and interviews with teachers and pupils and parents in Nigeria, for example, it seemed quite clear that this transition is not a tidy process, and that there was still a whole landscape of very different types of Islamic schools. I like to think of it as sort of a continuum of types. That there are still many schools that focus solely on Quranic memorization. There are some that focus on Quranic memorization but are geared towards slightly older children, and they are usually run by more itinerant teachers, and the pupils are sent to board with the teacher. They work for him. Sometimes they beg. And so it's kind of a different take on that kind of Quranic school. There are Islamia schools which call themselves Islamia, which really don't offer a full slate of secular subjects, and then there are those that do quite faithfully offer the entire government curriculum. So there's a whole range, and it's not a neat and tidy process. But and again, as I mentioned before, there's some data would suggest that the numbers that both the government and the religious authorities are keeping are not quite right in terms of how many schools actually do offer the full government curriculum and how many don't. But at any rate, it's a continuum of change. We found that the schools generally had male and female teachers, although tended to have more male teachers. Interestingly, they did tend to serve male and female students. And in Nigeria, there was a sense that parents were more comfortable sending their children to these schools. And in fact, they reported that. The majority reported that they felt more comfortable sending their children to these Islamic schools, but especially their daughters, because they felt they were safer and they were sure that they were learning appropriate material, and they were learning about Islam, which was extremely important to them. They appreciated the avenues for the kids to segue into the public system and sit for exams. And they did not seem to mind the greater regulation by the government of the schools, and they saw that as an extra layer of quality. So basically, the schools met with community approval and did seem to attract a high number of students, especially girls. So in Nigeria, there are a lot of schools who are aspiring, a lot of religious schools that are aspiring to become an Islamia school, a school that is registered with the government that offers the full curriculum. And so I think of it as sort of a funnel where these schools are kind of at varying stages, and they're kind of entering this little tunnel, and they're going to come out the other end as an integrated religious school. And this process is ongoing, and it has some costs to it as well, and some challenges, right? We've talked about some of the challenges in mobilizing Islamic schools to kind of get in this queue and become an integrated school. I mentioned the inaccurate school data that's out there, which is always a bit of a challenge. Another is, though, that a lot of these Islamic schools tend to be very resource lean. So they're extremely poor schools. They're not necessarily set up to transfer right over to teaching a whole slate of subjects. I know in Ghana there were some issues of they had to set some physical infrastructure limits for a school to be registered with the government, because they found that there'd be schools with no roof or no walls that would be trying to register as a school, and so the resource lean element of the environment tends to be a challenge. Teacher qualifications also tend to be a challenge. In Mali, for example, when we did a survey of teacher qualifications, most teachers in these registered madrasas had a 9th grade education. Those with a director who had a higher level of education tended to have teachers with higher levels of education, but that would mean maybe a high school diploma or maybe a year or two of college. Existing teachers in the Islamia schools are often, they've been trained in Arabic. They're often not capable yet of teaching, say, English or French or science or things like that, so that there is some challenge in getting the personnel in there. This is also true in Nigeria. Now, some of the data we had from Nigeria in 2006 was a small sample of schools that had participated in a USAID-funded project the previous years. And so we did about 60 teacher questionnaires, interviewing head teachers and principals from about 17 schools, and did about 22 teacher interviews and found some interesting information. From all of this, we synthesized some of the findings here. Let's see. Parents see Islamic schools as offering the best of both worlds. So parents were extremely enthusiastic about these integrated Islamic schools. Whether that still holds in the context now of Boko Haram and the campaign they've been launching, because they seem to be singularly against this idea of an integrated school that offers both Islamic studies and secular subjects. But at the time, parents seemed quite invested in this model, and they thought it was just the best of both worlds. They got a religious education, and their children were able to access secular subjects. We did find that the Islamic school teachers tended to plateau in their use of some of the new instructional techniques that projects had tried to introduce in comparison to public school teachers. And this was in 2 out of the 3 states in this study, and those states were Kano and Nasarawa and Lagos. We saw that in the Islamia schools, student-centered teaching methods were talked about and practiced to a certain degree. Some of the ideas took root, but the forms of active learning were in practice in some ways more than the substance. There were some serious gaps in the implementation, and despite the at least verbal embracing of active learning and student-centered techniques, there was still a lot of memorization-based lessons, a lot of recitation and recall as opposed to engagement and inquiry in the schools, which would suggest that the schools have a way to go, these Islamic schools. Now, we also saw that the Islamia schools did not have the same access to information that public schools had. In other words, the state ministries of education had communication networks that involved the public schools, and the Islamia schools were at something of a disadvantage in terms of accessing assistance that they might need, for example, in teacher training and other things, if they noticed that their teachers needed some additional help. Across the board, everyone we talked to in the Islamia school really focused on resources. They were integral to questions and answers on school quality, what would make the school better, how it could be upgraded, what children needed, and everything like that. And that's very logical because these schools were resource poor. The teachers and the head teachers had a great deal of faith in the power of training, which was interesting. So they were more than willing to participate in training programs. We observed that in a project in Nigeria that was implemented around that time, where the uptake of some of the training techniques and materials on the part of the Islamia schools was better than on the part of the public schools, and often the community involvement was better than that of the public schools. We also found, unsurprisingly, that the religious nature of the school was very key to the perceptions of quality that people expressed. Parents, teachers, others, they really saw that as a key element in the school's quality. The communities, when we asked parents in the broader community if they were interested in school aid, they were, as long as the religious mission of the school is not compromised. They saw the schools as providing important educational services and cultural capital. Some of that, for example, in Mali, is just the ability to speak Arabic is an admired thing. We did see, though, some schools struggling to maintain the essence of Islamic education, that blend of spiritual and intellectual education. Government curricula often tends to be very full, and so in some cases schools complained about the actual Islamic subjects being relegated to the end of the day or to a couple hours a week or things like that. One school in Ghana was opened against the government because it declared that the weekend was, I think it was Thursday and Friday, and the government weekend is Saturday and Sunday, and so it ran into clashes of those types. It did seem that the schools were losing a lot of the traditional pedagogical methods associated with Islamic schooling, and were very much looking to public schools as the kind of the standard and the inspiration for how they should be. And as somebody who's interested in the more traditional methods of Islamic schooling, I found that perhaps that could be a loss in some ways, because traditional Islamic schools did encourage, for example, collaborative learning and things like that. And you find sometimes that public schools in Nigeria and other places don't really focus on that there's not a lot of student-to-student communication and learning, not as much of a kind of coaching relationship from the teacher and things like that. So I think in this kind of surge to integrate schools, some of the more interesting features of Islamic pedagogy are being lost. And then some conclusions we came to were that there are, if you look for them, there are studies on some of these schools that do exist and should be consulted. The religious mission of the school is very key to being allowed to work with schools. Increasingly, they provide important educational and services and cultural capital, but it's important to understand the role that they play in the community before designing an intervention. As I had just said, schools are struggling to maintain some balance of the essence of Islamic education and the focus on the kind of personal development blended with, the focus on national development and economically viable skills and things like that. The El-Majri in Nigeria in particular are being marginalized more and more, and some re-examination of the value of the type of education they have and their own self-perceptions, such as a Hoshner article from, I believe, 2011. Those kind of studies, I think, are more necessary, because that is a trend of schooling that is still very much in existence and not very well understood. Memorization is still seen as a learning technique, as appropriate as it is for the Quran, because that is a sacred document, and memorizing it is part of a long history of religious learning. Moving teachers away from memorization in other subjects is probably going to be key if these Islamia schools are going to actually offer students, a sound education that's going to meet some of their hopes and dreams. And that active learning, student-centered instruction in these schools and in training programs needs to be better connected to the roots of traditional Islamic learning, which are very much in line with those things: learning circles, apprenticeship, relational learning, collaborative learning, self-pacing, and coaching, so that the methods that government and donor agencies are encouraging Islamia teachers to adopt are not in any way un-Islamic. They're very related to traditions of Islamic learning. But the process of thinking through how a school is going to retain its Islamic character and still offer, hardcore science education is a challenge. And that is probably one of the bigger challenges that schools are facing as they are kind of moving along this continuum from strictly religious schools to schools with a religious mission that are contributing to the Millennium Development Goals and education for all.
Great.
So I think I'll stop there.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Helen. I'm sure our callers have enjoyed that and have many questions raised in their minds. So we're going to shift to that portion of our call now. We'll open the lines for questions. And as a reminder, if you have a question and you haven't already done so, press 5* and you'll be placed into the queue. Once your turn to ask a question, our call administrator, Lindsay Kunz, will announce your name and unmute your line so that you can ask it. And then your line will be placed back on mute immediately following the asking of a question. Also note that if you are already in the queue and for any reason decide that you no longer wish to ask a question, for instance, if somebody else asked it already, you can simply press 5* again and your name will be erased from the queue. And one final note, for the sake of other callers, I'll ask that when you're called upon, please immediately ask your question rather than providing your own commentary. So with that, Lindsay, can we have our first question, please?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Huber, and thank you, Dr. Boyle. Today, our first question comes from Ms. Courtney Broad. Courtney, go ahead, please. Thank you so much, Dr. Boyle. You mentioned that many girls are going to the Islamia schools, and my question was, how does this trend towards integrated Islamia schools in northern Nigeria impact the development of girls? And also, how are these schools perceived by the Christian community?
Good question. The first part of the question on girls, I think that in some ways, integrated Islamia schools offer girls a chance for an education that they might not otherwise have. Parents who would be skeptical of public schools are not as skeptical of an integrated Islamia school, and they will send their girls to those schools. Recent studies indicate that, especially among poorer families, girls have a better chance of going to a religious school than no school at all, as the option. And that is encouraging too. At least it gives girls, girls from poorer families some option for education. We also noted that, even in, for example, in rural areas in Mali, at least 30% of the population of integrated religious schools in those areas, 30% of the population of students were female. And that was an interesting development because it meant that even in some of these very conservative rural areas, when a religious option was there, parents were willing to pay school fees and everything, even for girls to go. Probably some more campaigning would get that number to parity so that you'd have, 50% at least of girls, as the population of the schools. But in Nigeria, it seemed that they were very popular. Regarding Christians, you don't often see Christian families sending their kids to Islamic schools, especially in northern Nigeria. I don't think that there is resistance to the notion of an integrated Islamic school. I mean, there are certainly, Catholic and other Christian schools that offer the full government curriculum in places in the north as well. But there's a lot of religious tension there too. And if indirectly, if you're sort of asking, well, are these integrated Islamia schools promoting a sort of Islamic-centric notion of the north and encouraging any of the the kind of discord or violence? I can't say in the most accurate sense, but the schools that we looked at and have visited and everything were much more concerned with their basic educational mission than with any kind of larger political concern. So I would say that those integrated Islamia schools would very much be targets of a Boko Haram as much as any of the Christian schools.
Interesting.
Thank you, Dr. Boyle. Our next question comes from Rachel Abuso. Rachel, go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to ask, why would parents in northern Nigeria reject Western education for their children? Is there some sort of underlying ethos that differentiates it substantially from Islamic education?
I think some of it goes back to the colonial history, where people were very afraid that the kind of Western schools that were offered, which were often missionary run, they were afraid that these schools would separate children from their religion. So that there was, at the time, toward the end of colonialism, there was a turn towards indigenous institutions as opposed to kind of trusting some of these schools, these public schools. As that period has passed and as public schools became more available, I think parents have used them and tried them. The trouble in northern Nigeria is that, and in other places in Nigeria as well, I guess, is that the quality of the public schools is not always that good. Parents see a lot of corruption in the system. They see that their kids aren't doing very well. They're not getting much attention. They're, teachers are indifferent or whatever. And so they've become somewhat negative just on the public schools in general, and they've looked at these Islamic schools as, just a better alternative in some ways. Now, whether they truly are is another question. I mean, I'm not sure that there's enough data on that yet to say that, they're not a good alternative, but, I think some of it is just parents are disillusioned with what they see as just the poor quality of schooling, and corruption in the education system that just doesn't seem to get better.
Okay, our next question comes from Mr. Corey Bender. Corey, please ask your question.
Hi. I was wondering if there are any secular subjects that the Islamic schools won't teach or won't teach the entire subject. For example, how some Christian schools in the U.S. won't teach evolution.
I think that's a really good question, and I think it's something that needs to be studied. Right now, it seems as though there is a lot of insistence that the schools take on the government curriculum and that they teach it. And so far, it doesn't seem like there's anything so objectionable that they've put their foot down and said that they won't teach it. But I think that so much of the energy has been on simply helping the schools to get to the point where they can offer the full curriculum, that there has been less examination of how they're actually doing with it. And you know, I think some looking at the finer points of what they take and what they don't take is probably warranted and would be very interesting. I would venture to say that schools would conveniently ignore what they think is, if they think it's completely un-Islamic or against Islamic principles. But that's probably not too likely in the government curriculum, because Nigeria has had to balance, its large Christian and large Muslim populations, and I can't think offhand of anything that's like singularly objectionable in some of the primary curricula to either side.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Mr. Michael Sairway. Michael, go ahead, please.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Boyle. Could you possibly expand a little bit on how state governments in the North interact with Islamia schools, especially day-to-day interactions and kind of attitudes and relationships between administrators?
The state basic education offices usually have a unit that's dedicated to working with the Islamia schools, and part of working with them is certifying them to be registered, like deciding that they have made the appropriate adjustments, adopted their curriculum, have the right teachers or whatever. So there's that part of it. And then there is the teacher supervision, which is, going out and looking at the schools and doing the kind of inspection. Public schools don't get a lot of attention in that respect. So it doesn't seem like Islamic schools would necessarily get a lot more. I mean, in general, in Nigeria, in the public schools, if you get a visit, even once a year, you're doing well. And I think that that's probably the case in the Islamic schools too, because the government resources are kind of stretched that way. So that's part of the relationship, is that regulatory piece. But again, the school principals and the school proprietors of the Islamia schools are the ones who are really in charge. And I think that there's an element of confusion in that, for example, if I'm a school proprietor in northern Nigeria and I decide, we need some more books, we need some Arabic books, we just don't have enough, or they're inadequate or whatever. If I have the funds from, collecting tuition or from getting donations from, alumni or philanthropists in the community, I can go out and buy those books, right? I can make a decision and go implement it. Public school principals have more of an issue with that. They don't have that kind of money at their disposal to go out and make that decision and make that purchase. So I think the government would like the schools, the Islamic schools, to be a bit more, standardize a bit more and consult, the hierarchy in terms of decisions like that. And I think the schools are very reluctant to lose all of their autonomy that way. I mean, these are, even though they've agreed to register with the government, they are private schools, and they're funded by donations and fee payments, and there's only so much that the government can regulate, in that respect. So I think that there's a fine line that the schools have to walk. They want to keep the registration status because they want the children to be able to move from the religious schools to the public schools, but at the same time, they have maintained a certain amount of autonomy just because they're private schools. And how that all will play out over the next few years will be interesting.
All right. Our next question comes from Ms. Kristen Lundquist. Kristen, please state your question.
Hi, Dr. Boyle. My question actually is closely related to the last one, in that with the upcoming elections and the possibility of religious tension and possibly violence, what would you say, what's the possibility, or does it look like the government might become more involved in the day-to-day happenings of the religious schools, just as kind of a precautionary oversight?
Mm-hmm. That would be my guess, and I think that the momentum has been on the side of more regulation. As this process has gone on more, I think at the state level, more issues have come up where policymakers have thought, okay, we really need to think through this a little bit more. That it's not just a matter of handing them the curriculum and saying, okay, you're all set, and by the way, here's a teacher or two. It's about helping them kind of integrate a little bit more purposefully. So I would say yes, that the trend will be, especially given the kind of shaky situation, would be towards the government sort of slowly moving to take a little bit more power and oversight. I mean, I think that's the direction they seem to want to go in. I mean, it was the direction when I've talked to the heads of the state boards of education in 2004, even before things were as tense. That was where they wanted to go. So I can't picture they really changed too much on that. And the insecurity is bound to breed more of a sort of regulatory mindset. That said, I never got the feeling that people were fearful of what some of these Islamic schools were teaching.
All right. We do not have any more questions in the queue at this time.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, I have just one question I'll add to the mix here as well. And thank you for all your insight and this fascinating subject, which I think is just going to continue to be kind of a front burner concern with Nigeria's overall cultural and political issues. And one aspect of this that I'd be interested in hearing a bit more about is in the West, especially, where you often hear about engaging moderate Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
That is a goal, and cultivating moderate Islam is a goal. And it's fraught with difficulty, I think, sometimes because what's a moderate, and who gets to decide that kind of question, and can even be a kind of a condescending matter. And so I'm just wondering if you've seen, even at just an anecdotal level, some examples of schooling, whether in Nigeria or elsewhere, Islamic schools that seem to have come up with a really promising model that could be emulated in terms of really imparting an Islamic education that to the Muslims themselves does not seem really obviously watered down in some sense, but is seen as authentic and legitimate, but also yields attitudes about politics, especially, and that the West could recognize as moderate.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think in terms of a sort of a model. I could see elements of some things I've seen in Ghana and in Mali that could, possibly come together with some examples of what's going on in Nigeria. Ghana is what comes to mind mostly, though. That there are a set of schools in the north of Ghana. One of them, the Ambariya school, and there are three others that are older Islamic schools that accepted the government integration quite a while ago. And, despite bumps in the road in terms of government regulation and what's going to be taught, visits to those schools, I just thought that they were very impressive and that they had kind of hit their stride in terms of finding some balance. One of the things that characterized all of them, that if I remember correctly, was a very long school day. They really didn't want to give in on watering down the Islamic education, so they really, they offered the full government curriculum, and then they used some afternoon time for the Islamic studies, and it ended up being a fairly long school day for the kids, but they did manage to sort of balance the government requirements and the full curriculum with an unwatered down, say, focus on memorizing the Quran and then going through and, looking at fiqh and tajweed and everything like that. So I'm not sure there's any shortcut way to do it. I've wondered if there's a way to do it where some of the Islamic subjects were used to teach other things, whether language or, if they could integrate that way. I hadn't seen that yet, though, on the ground. But whereas you would use, say, Quranic texts in a language arts class or things like that. Right. But I don't think they've gotten to that level of coming up with a special curriculum.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, fascinating stuff and much to keep an eye on going forward. So I think we'll just, unless there are any other questions that have come in the queue, Lindsay, then we'll wrap up for today. And thank you again, Dr. Boyle, for your insight into these matters. And I want to take the opportunity as well to invite our callers to join us on our next Faith and International Affairs Conference call, which will be on Thursday, August 28th. That call will feature Hien Vu, who is Vietnam Programs Manager at IGE, and Hien's topic will be Religious Freedom in Vietnam, Implications for the Future of Asia. And let me also invite your feedback and suggestions for this conference call series. Feel free to submit any comments or recommendations that you may have to the same email address at which you RSVP'd. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.